Good morning, everybody. This is the Mack Road Sunday AM class on Samuel the Chronicles. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 6. And let me give you the chart I usually start off with. A little distracted here as our intern Albert is here with us. Say hi, Albert.
Hello.
Albert will be making comments at the appropriate time whenever he feels like it. But this is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel the Chronicle study. We're in 2 Samuel 13, verse 6. Remember that as we take a look at Samuel, one of the things that we notice is that first Samuel dealt with Samuel the prophet and told us about his life, and then Saul, the first king. And then we had David who came after that. And when David came after that, he came and he didn't get to really be king, even though God anointed him king during Saul's reign. He didn't get to be king until Saul died. And so that brought us then to 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, we notice that King David reigned for the first 7 years in Hebron or in Judah. And then for the next 33 years, he's going to reign over all of Israel in Jerusalem. But we notice that the first 10 chapters dealt with David's successes and how much he grew. And then we had this sin that happened with Bathsheba in chapter 11 and 12. And now we're in chapter 13 as we're looking at now the trouble that David's going to have because of his family. We're going to be talking about that. As we do that, remember that we're also talking about First Chronicles, and First Chronicles deals with 2 Samuel. And First Chronicles doesn't have a lot more to add to 2 Samuel than what 2 Samuel has in it. So we'll look at Chronicles whenever we need to. Also remember that since we're looking at the kingdom of Israel, remember that when it started off as a united kingdom with Saul, David, and Solomon, and we're in David's reign. Then it's going to be divided into those two different dynasties. You're going to have Jeroboam and you're going to have Rehoboam. We're going to have the line of David, and you're going to have the line that's not of David. This is the tribes of Israel up here, and this is the tribes of Judah down here. So when we get to that, we'll be looking at that chart a little more, but just wanted to show it to you so you can take a look at it. But as we think about David, remember that what we have with David is that we have the story of Amnon and Tamar. And what we covered was the fact that Amnon loved Tamar, and at least he thought he did. And he pretended to be sick. And he had a friend named Jonadab. And Jonadab came up with an idea that if you pretend to be sick, then we'll talk to your dad, and your dad maybe will send Tamar, and then you can talk with her or do whatever you want to do with her. And so that's where we're at here as we look at 2 Samuel 13 and verse 6. And we're looking not only at Amnon, but we're actually looking at the psychology of what we might call sin and the way sin works in our life a lot of times. A lot of times people don't understand why it is they do the things that they do, but it's as a result of the reaction of sin. So let's read a little bit, and then we will get started. So I'm going to have Albert read, if he would, from verses 6 up here, all the way down here to about verse 17. So from 6 to 17, Albert's going to read for us, and we'll come back and talk about it.
So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cake in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." David sent to the house of Tamar, saying, "Go now to your brother Amnon's house and prepare for food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was laying down. She took dough, kneaded it, made cake in her sight, and baked cakes. She took the pan and dishes them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, Have everyone got out from me?" So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food to the bedroom, then I may eat from your hand." So Tamar took the cake which she had made and brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. When she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come lay with me, my sister." But she answered to him, "No, my brother, No, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of those fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. However, he would not listen to her since he was stronger than she. He violated her and laid with her. Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, for the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had for her. He had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go away."
All right. So as you can tell, Albert isn't from the United States. Where are you from, Albert?
Ghana.
Albert's from Ghana. So he has a little different accent than we do. But that's one of the things that we're going to teach him to get over is his accent so that everybody can understand him. And that's why he pronounces king a little different than we do, because that's the way they say it in Ghana. But here's what I want you to understand. As we're talking about Amnon here, Amnon lays down and pretends to be sick. And when the king comes to see him, Amnon says to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make me a couple of cakes in my sight that I may eat from her hand." And so basically, he asked David to send Tamar so that Tamar could come and eat with him, or he could eat from her. Now, it's interesting that David went ahead and did that, and because David should have known better, but part of the problem was that David had some sin in his life. He had just finished having that sin with Bathsheba and killing her husband. And so therefore that affects a person's ability to be able to judge properly. And that's the reason why Jesus is our judge. And that's why Jesus will judge fairly, because there's no prejudices in the life of Jesus that would make him less tolerable to sin or more tolerable to sin because of anything that he personally might have done. And so Jesus can judge us perfectly, but David has a problem, and that's going to be David's problem throughout the rest of his life, is that he's going to allow his children to do stuff that he himself did. And so no doubt that's probably because of the guilt that he felt for what it was that he did. And that also affects our lives as well. And we need to understand that. If you grew up as an individual who was lustful and you slept around a lot, then you're probably going to have trouble talking to your children about sex, because you're going to feel like you don't have the right to do that. Or if you were an individual who was greedy or selfish, you're going to have trouble talking to your children when they become selfish. And what we need to understand is God has cleansed us from those and forgiven us from those activities, and therefore we can approach them. But we don't approach them as individuals who say we've never had the problem. We approach them as individuals who say we understand because we've had the problems. We've had the lustful desires. We've had the desire for greed and for money. And so therefore, let me tell you how to avoid those instead of letting the people fall into it. But that's going to be David's problem, and that's what we see here. And so it says in verse 7, then David sent to the house of Tamar, saying, "Go now to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." You see, if this was going on in my house, I would ask, why in the world do you need Tamar to go? We have plenty of cooks who can cook everything that Tamar can cook. Why do you want her to go? And why do you want her to go in your house? Why do you want her to go in your bedroom? That's not acceptable. But because David had sinned and David lusted after a woman, he had difficulty saying that. Verse 8 says, so Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was lying down, and she took dough and kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. Now notice that it says she made the cakes in his sight. See, there's something wrong when a guy has to see how the food is cooked because he's sick. If I'm sick, I don't have to see how the food is cooked. Just give me the food and I'll eat it if I'm sick. But this was a pretense and something was going on. And David wasn't keen enough because of his own sin and his own prejudice to be able to see it. And so he said, Amnon says, make the cakes in front of me. And so in verse 9, it says, and so she took the pan and dishes and dished them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, have everyone go out from me. So everyone went out from him. And again, here we see another problem. Amnon is going to be alone with this virgin in his room. and in his house. And not only that, but he's going to invite her into his bedroom. And that's a definite no-no, even though he's sick. And so he tells everybody to leave so that they won't see what he's doing and he won't have any accountability. And so that's why it's important for us to always have individuals around us, especially when you're dating, especially when if you're a young person and you're dating. You're going to have problems if you want to be alone with that individual. I know when I was growing up, I had problems when I was alone. I never had problems with lust and those desires when I was around a bunch of people. It was when I got alone. And so as a Christian, you need to understand that if you're going to be alone with individuals that maybe you desire or something, you need to have your good Christian friends around you, not friends like Amnon had, who encouraged him to do wrong, this Jonadab guy, but good friends who are concerned about doing what God says. And so they're the ones that will help you. So it's always good to have those good friends around you so that we can be held accountable to what it is that we know we need to do. But he told the people in his house to go away. And of course, he's the king's son. And so when he commands people to do stuff, they would generally do it. And so they all left and everyone went out of his house. Now, verse 10 says, and then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat from your hand. So Tamar took cakes which she had made and brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. Now, I'm a guy, right, Albert? I look like a guy. Sure, I don't look like a girl, right?
No.
Okay, so I'm speaking from a guy's perspective, and what we need to understand is, even though I'm a guy, us guys have different problems, but that doesn't leave Tamar without any responsibility, because Tamar should have known that something was going on, and Tamar should have refused to be alone with him in the room, in his room, and especially when he wants her to go into the bedroom. Tamar should have been wise enough or intelligent enough to be able to say, no, this isn't a good idea. Let's get other people around here so they can help me with you, so she can be held accountable. And so sometimes, rather than individuals helping us stay faithful to God, they enable us to sin. And that's part of what Tamar was doing. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that Tamar was responsible for the rape, but Tamar could have put other obstacles in the way in order for it to be more difficult for Amnon. And maybe she was naive and maybe she didn't know what was going on. And so maybe this is a lesson that all young ladies need to learn. Sometimes there's a reason why a guy wants to be alone with you. And it's not just to tell you sweet nothings in your ear. It's because there's something more lustful in his desire. And so we need to be careful of that, especially when we're young people, because we have our raging hormones, and those raging hormones sometimes get us to do things that we otherwise wouldn't do, and we're going to feel bad about having done them. And so in verse 9 it says, and she took the pan and dished them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, have everyone go out from me. So everyone went out. And then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat from your hands. So Tamar took the cakes which she had made and brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. And I think it's interesting that it says to her brother Amnon, because this isn't something that she would expect her brother to do to her. This isn't something that you would expect that to happen. I have known, however, of cases where there's incest in the family. And so you need to be careful of that also. You need to understand that there's certainly a time when children are developing, when you shouldn't have a brother and sister in the same room at the same time because of the raging hormones that go on, or because of puberty that they're going through. And so we need to make arrangements for that if we're good parents and if we understand, how we develop as human beings, that sometimes that's more difficult, and certainly not encourage that. And so that's part of what was going on here. And it says in verse 11, it says, when she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come lie with me, my sister. Now I want you to notice that she did everything she could to try to get away from him. And we're going to notice that she was forced. And so therefore it's not her culpability that is in question here, it's his. And so in verse 12, it says, but she answered, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And so basically what she's saying is, no, you're my brother. We're not supposed to do this. So she understood that it was wrong, and I certainly believe that he understood that it was wrong, or he wouldn't have gone through this charade in order to get her secretly by himself. And he knew it was wrong, and she knew it was wrong, and she was trying to resist, but he wasn't. And that's one thing that we need to remember. If you're a Christian, people who are in the world, they have the pull of the world that's pulling against you. It's kind of like, if you look at it this way, if you're standing on top of a table and you want to pull somebody up to the table, is it easier for you to pull them up on the table or for them to pull you down? And the answer is it's easier for them to pull you down. Well, why is that? Because you have gravity working against you. And that's the same thing here. So because of that, Amnon was able to force her because the gravity of sin was greater than her ability to, and her strength, physical strength, in order to resist it. And so and though she was violated, she's not culpable, but there could have been some things that she could have done to make it more difficult for him. And that's all I'm telling you, young ladies. Make it as difficult as you can for somebody to take advantage of you. Be on your watch, even if he says he loves you, especially if he says he loves you. Be careful, because if he really loves you, he would respect your purity. And so it says in verse 13, as for me, where could I go to get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. Basically, she says, look, if you talk to the king, he will be happy to make arrangements probably, and he'll even make an exception maybe to the law, because the law said that you weren't supposed to marry your brother's sister or your brother's daughter, or you weren't supposed to marry too close in your family line, but there could have been exceptions. And so she's saying maybe the king would make an exception, just go ask him. But of course, he's in the middle of his lustful passion, and therefore he's not thinking properly and isn't going to do that. And that's the reason why, young ladies, you need to be careful about being involved with somebody who is in the midst of puberty and wants to get you alone. And verse 14 says, however, he would not listen to her, and since he was stronger than her, he violated her and lay with her. And so he, being stronger than her, of course, lay with her. And no doubt she did whatever it was that she needed to do in order to try to get away from him, but it didn't work, and to no avail. Now, that's sin. His lust has grown, and it's caused him to sin. And that reminds us of the statements that God makes over here in James chapter 1, when he talks about sin, and when he talks about what sin is and how come sin comes. He says in verse 12 of James chapter 1, he says, blessed is the man who preserves under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive a crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So God says we need to resist temptation. Now, verse 13 says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. And so God points out that sin is caused not because of something God did or because God made women pretty, and so it's God's fault that Amnon did this. This happened because Amnon had a lustful desire and wasn't willing to satisfy his desire in the manner in which God said he could satisfy it, which was to get married. Instead, he had to violate his sister. And so that's what we see here. Now, I want you to notice what happens as a result of that. You might think, oh, good, Amnon gets this daughter, and maybe he will be noble, like, I can't remember the guy's name, but maybe he'll be noble like the individual who raped, I believe her name was...
Is it Dinah?
Dinah, thank you, yeah. Yeah, and Dinah was raped, and the person who raped her actually wanted to marry her and came. And if you remember, he tried to get an agreement with Israel, and Israel's sons deceived them. You remember, that's when they said they need to be circumcised, and then we can give our daughters to them to marry. And so they did that. Then they went in and killed them all. You remember all that? Yeah. Well, that reminds us of this. At least that individual, I believe his name was Phineas, or can't remember his exact name. But anyway, he at least wanted to do the right thing. And God also made arrangements in the scriptures that if two young people had relationships with one another, and neither one of them were engaged or betrothed, that the law says they were supposed to get married with one another. And so he could have done the right thing. He still could have done something that was beneficial, even though he had started this in an awful way with sin. He could have done what was right, and being right would have been to marry her. But instead, look at what happens in verse 15. It says, then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, for the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, get up and go away. So that's why, by the way, verse 16 says, but she said to him, no, because this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you have done to me. Yet he would not listen to her. Now, I want us to think for just a minute, why in the world would Amnon then hate her so much if he was so much in love with her before? And that was because he was dealing with her on the basis of lust, on the basis of his desire. Now, until he actually did something, you might say that his lust hadn't developed totally and hadn't blossomed into this evil activity. But now what happens is every time he sees her, every time Amnon sees Tamar, rather than thinking, here's the lady who waited for me and I waited for her so that we can be pure when we got married. Every time he sees her, he's going to be thinking it's her fault. Now, it's not her fault. Don't misunderstand me. It's not her fault, but he's going to be thinking it's her fault that I did this thing. And if she hadn't been here, it wouldn't have happened. And so rather than him loving her, he was only really loving himself. And now every time he sees her, he's going to remember that. And that therefore it caused him to hate her, because really what he's doing is he's hating himself because of what he did, because he knew it was wrong. But every time he sees her now, he's going to be reminded of his sinful activity. And that's what happens quite often with young people when they're young. They will engage in premarital sex, and the girl, usually it's the girl usually means this is going to tie us together and we're going to be connected, and the young man will marry me. And it ends up that they don't, and he ends up going somewhere else. And if he doesn't learn anything, he keeps doing it over and over and over and violating young ladies. And the young lady doesn't learn because she's thinking that her sexuality is what's going to keep him. And that's not what keeps somebody connected to, young ladies and young men. It's not our sexuality. What keeps us connected to one another is our love for God. Because if you love God, you're going to be faithful to your wife, whether she has sex with you or not, whether she stays pretty or not, whether she becomes rich or not, or gets sick or not. You're going to stay with her and you're going to love her because you're doing it not because of who she is, but because of who you are. And that's why Amnon hated her. He hated her because he's now, every time he sees her, he's reminded of his own sin and his own iniquity. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah. Once it wasn't true love, and the opposite of love is hate. That was what the result was going to be.
That's right.
Yeah. So,
yeah. Because if he really loved her, maybe he was a little too anxious and took advantage of her, but he could have married her. Mm-hmm. But he ends up hating her. Yeah. Because in reality, he's now looking at his own sin every time he sees her, and therefore he hates her. And so he drives her away. So verse 16 says, but she said to him, no, because this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you have done to me. Yet he would not listen to her. Now, I'm going to have Albert read a little bit more for us from verses 17, if he would, down here to about verse 22.
From verse 17, then he called this young man who attended to him and said, now throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her. Now she had on a long sleeve garment, for in the manner of a virgin daughters of a king dress themselves in a robe. Then his attendant took her out and locked the door behind her. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her long sleeve garment, which was on her. And she put her hand on her head and went away crying aloud as she went. Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? But now keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart." So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother's Absalom house. Now, then David heard of all these matters. He was very angry. But Absalom did not speak to Amnon, neither good or bad. For Absalom hated Amnon because he violated his sister Tamar.
So Amnon gets his way with Tamar and throws her out. Not only that, but he throws her out in a public way. Verse 17 says, then he calls his young men who attended him and said, now throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her. Now she had a long sleeve garment, for in this manner the virgin daughters of the kings dressed themselves in robes. And then his attendants took her out and locked the door behind her. One of the things that we need to understand is sin because not only does it violate God's will, but it also causes us to act in a hurtful and harmful way towards other people. And that's what you see going on here. Sometimes men, especially men in the United States, because of our moral conditions in the United States, they will boast about the number of girls that they've had, or they'll boast about the people that they've slept with, as if that's some kind of a badge for them. And what they fail to understand is that's hurting individuals. It's causing individuals not to respect men. It's causing ladies not to respect men or to trust them, and it's creating difficulty in the world. And so that's what you have going on here, and that's the reason why he threw her out. And it says that she had this long sleeve garment. In other words, in their day and time, being a virgin was something to be proud of. In our day and time, it seems to be something that you're not proud of. Matter of fact, you don't want people to know that you're a virgin, but that's because of the sinful condition and the moral impurity that we have in our world today, and especially in the United States, where that's considered, kind of a badge of honor. And every television show that you see people jumping in bed every 5 minutes and acting like nothing happens. But really, it affects individuals and it affects people. And not only that, of course, it's a violation of God's law and a violation of God, and therefore it causes us to sin and to spiritually die in his presence. But it said that she had this long sleeve garment because she was the virgin daughter. But now she understood that she wasn't anymore, and she took it and she tore it. And I think that says something about her character. And by that, I mean, she wasn't going to hide the fact that it didn't happen. She wasn't going to act like that this terrible event never happened in her life. She's accepting the consequences of it, even though it wasn't her fault. She's accepting the consequences of it and tore her garment so that people would understand that she's no longer a virgin, that in their day and time, she would be a lady who is defiled. And that's the reason why she stayed in Amnon's house for the rest of her life. But it says, then his attendants took her and threw her out and locked the door behind her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her long sleeve garment, which was on her. And she put her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. And so it creates problems. So don't ever think that you can have what America calls an affair and think that it doesn't affect somebody. And if you have an affair and it doesn't affect somebody, it's because those two people that it didn't affect are already so affected, they don't realize the effect it's having on them. That's the problem. It's not that it doesn't have an effect. It's that they've been affected so much that it doesn't bother them anymore. That's how bad it is for them. But take individuals who are virgins and it has an effect on them. And so remember that as we think about our spirituality and our sexuality that God has given us to be used in a proper way and to be satisfied in a proper way. And so let's see what else happens, because once this happens, it doesn't just affect the person that it happened to. It's not like it's just going to affect Tamar. Tamar has a family. Tamar has a family that has a reputation. And that family is going to be marred as a result of this, as a result of this defamation. And so it says in verse 20, then Absalom, her brother, this is her actual biological brother, not her half brother. Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? And I find that really interesting because it doesn't say that Tamar told him that Amnon did this. So what this tells me is that if David had had any kind of inkling of what a father should do, everybody else apparently knew that Amnon had eyes for Tamar. And being her father, he should have protected her and taken care of her and not let her get into that position instead of actually being the one who promoted that position that she was in, because Absalom knew about it. Absalom knew that if something happened to Tamar, it was because of what Amnon did, because Amnon was out to get in her pants, you might say. And so it wasn't something that wasn't known. It was something that was rather obvious. And that's the reason why I find this interesting, because David didn't do anything about it. And I'm suggesting to you that the reason he didn't was because his moral compass had also been altered with his affair and with his sin that he had. And so he might have thought, who is he to say anything? Or maybe he even thought to himself, maybe I'm being too picky. Maybe this isn't going on. And so whatever the case is, he wasn't attuned to what was happening. And so one of the reasons that we need to keep ourselves pure from sin is not just for us, but so that we can help other people in sin. And that's one of the things that we need to understand. So Absalom said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? But now keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart. Well, just because you say that to somebody doesn't mean they're not, and doesn't mean it's not going to affect them in their heart. Matter of fact, it affected Tamar so much that she remained in his house and was desolate in her brother's Absalom's house. That's how he affected her, and that's how this event affected her. It made her to where she herself did not feel worthy enough to engage in a proper relationship, and therefore she was left desolate and in her brother Absalom's house. Now, it then says in verse 21, and notice again, because remember that part of what's going on here is the punishment that God is inflicting on David and the consequences that he's inflicting on David because of the sin that he had with Bathsheba. Remember that he said that his family would always be in turmoil and that there would always be violence in his home. Well, look at what it says here, verse 21. Now, when King David heard of all of these matters, he was very angry, period. He was very angry and did what? What did he do? He didn't do anything. He just got angry. You know people like that? You know people who get angry and they get angry and but they never do anything about what they're angry. They're just angry all the time. Some parents are like that. They get angry with their kids when they find out their kids do something, but they don't do anything. There's no consequences to what their children did that made them angry. The Bible does tell us it's okay to be angry, but we're not to sin in our anger. That's what he says in Ephesians chapter 4. He says that we're to be angry, but we're not to sin. And why is that? Because God gets angry. But when God gets angry, he gets angry in a righteous manner, and there's consequences to his anger. He doesn't just get angry in order to be angry and then doesn't do anything. He gets angry and then gets at the heart of the issue. David, however, did not. And that's the reason why you're going to notice in the rest of this little verse here in verse 22, you're going to notice what Absalom does. Because if David had done the right thing and actually punished Amnon for what he did, then probably Absalom would not have this deep hatred for him. But since it seems like Amnon got away with it, then Absalom's sense of justice wasn't satisfied. And there needs to be justice in sin and in crimes. You know, we're living in a culture today where it seems that the criminals have no consequences to their crimes, especially in California. I don't know if you've heard, but some of the stores in San Francisco have had to close early because there's individuals who just walk in there and they take stuff off the shelf I mean, like hundreds of dollars worth of stuff, and they walk out and the police won't do anything to them. Nothing happens to them. There's no consequences because our governor has decided that any crime that's under $1,000 isn't worth being punished or isn't worth going after. And so therefore, those individuals do that. And so the stores in San Francisco have had to close early because of that. And that didn't affect just the store owners' bottom line, but it affects individuals who might need stuff from those stores later on, but now they're closed. And none of that can happen because there was no consequences to what was going on. And that's what we need to understand about God. And that's why Jesus has to come and die for us, because there are consequences to our sin. God is not like us. God is not just going to get mad or frustrated or upset and then act like there are no consequences. God says there's consequences, and the consequences have been placed there by God. If consequences were evil, God would not have placed consequences in the world. Consequences are designed to teach us, but there's also major consequences. And that is that when we sin, God says we die in a spiritual way. We die in our spiritual relationship to God because of our sin. And that's part of it. But notice what David does here. David, here's the matter. He says, oh, that's really wrong. Oh, that's terrible. No doubt. He gets angry, maybe even yells and screams for a little bit. But there's no justice. There's no administering the law. And so what happens when you don't administer the law? Well, people feel like they got to take it into their own hands, and they end up hating individuals because the law doesn't satisfy justice. And that's, as I pointed out, that's why Jesus died for us. And that's how much God loves us. He knows that there's consequences, but he wants us to understand there's consequences. And when we do and come to the knowledge of those consequences, he says, I have a remedy for your consequences. And that's Jesus, his word that became flesh and dwelt among us and died for us to pay for the consequences of our sin. Because if there's no consequences, then God is just like David, and God is greater than David. And so what happens as a result of David's inactivity? Well, look at verse 22. But Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad. You see, not only did he get mad, but he didn't say a word to him. And so Absalom did not speak to Amnon good or bad. And so Absalom was just waiting for the right time. That's what it means when he didn't speak good or bad to him. He says, for Absalom hated Amnon. Well, why do you hate him? Because Amnon got away with rape, got away with violating his sister, and dad didn't even say anything about it. And so then it says, because he had violated his sister Tamar. And so it's certainly possible that Absalom had reason to hate Amnon, but yet God also tells us that we need to check our emotions and that we're not to hate people. Because even though David wasn't going to render consequences, what we need to understand is we don't seek our own vengeance, because God says vengeance is mine. What that means is God says, I will bear out and dish out the consequences if nobody else does. They will be given. And so you and I, even though our sense of justice might not be satisfied now, we're living by faith, and we believe that God will satisfy that sense of judgment in the day of judgment when he comes, if that sense of judgment doesn't get administered first by the proper authorities who are supposed to do that, which, by the way, is what the kings of the land are supposed to do, because that's what Romans tells us. In Romans chapter 13, it's interesting to me that people today, they're running around and they're saying, let's defund the police. Well, here's what you need to understand. That is the one thing that God says the government is supposed to do. They're supposed to bear the sword. They're supposed to protect people. They're supposed to be able to carry the sword for the purpose of punishing the criminals. And so what are you going to have if you defund the police? You're going to have lawlessness, and you're going to have individuals who aren't going to do what is right. Albert, in Africa, have you heard of places where the law has been averted and problems have happened?
Yeah, a lot. I think Libya is one typical example. When Gaddafi was killed, it has become more of a lawless ground. A whole lot of things go on there. And like some of the sub-Saharan people passed through Libya to Europe, and when they share the experiences of lawlessness there, it's like serious.
Right. Yeah. And that's because they've defunded the police there.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is Paul tells us that that's the very function for governments. That's the reason we have governments. He says in verse 3, for rulers are not a cause, this is Romans 13:3. He says, for rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do what is, do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is right or good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. And so therefore, he tells us that we're supposed to respect authority. And don't misunderstand that. We're not saying, and the Bible isn't teaching, that bad authority is what's to be respected. Sometimes you have to do that, but God is going to take out bad authority. And if we can do it in a lawful manner, that needs to be done. But you don't throw out all of the idea of protection and of enforcing laws, because then we're going to become a lawless society, as Albert talked about in some of his experience that he knows from the place where he grew up and the country from which he grew up. And so that's one of the reasons why Absalom hated him, because he'd violated his sister. And the very person who should have punished Amnon, who should have punished Amnon for that activity didn't. So if the government doesn't do it, then maybe you need to take matters into your own hands. And so Absalom hated Amnon. But remember, as Christians, we're not to hate even when we don't get justice, because God is the one who's going to avenge us and take care of us. And so as we continue reading, we're going to have Albert read from verse 23 down here to verse 30.
Verse 23. Now it came about after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shear in Bethshean, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Absalom came to the king and said, behold now, your servant has sheep shears. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. But the king said to Absalom, no, my son, we should not all go, for we will all be burdensome to you. Although he urged the king, he would not go, but bless him. Then Absalom said, if not, please, let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom urged him. He let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Absalom commanded his servants, saying, see now, when Amnon heart is merrying with the wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then put him to death. Do not fear. Have not I myself commanded you? Be courageous and be vigilant. The servants of Absalom did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted their mule and fled. Now it was while they were on their way that the report came to David, saying, Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. Then the king arose, tore his clothes, and laid on the ground, and all his servants were standing by his clothes torn.
Mm-hmm. So, what happens when you hate somebody and you have malice in your heart? It develops into sin. And that's why the Bible teaches us that we're not to have malice and we're not to hate our brother. And we're supposed to let God be the one who brings vengeance. And like I said, even though there might not be vengeance or justice brought about in our lifetime, God is going to eventually bring about justice. But what happens when you hate somebody? Well, look at verse 23. Now it came about after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shears in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Now, we know, because we just read the story, that there was a pretense of what was going on here. Sheep shearing time was a time when they would take their sheep and they would take the wool off. And it was a very festive time. It was a time when there was a lot of money and there were profits being made. And so they would throw a big party. And so you would invite your friends. And so Absalom had some sheep and he was having them sheared. And so it's a time for celebrating. And so he invites all the king's sons. Now notice it says he invites all the king's sons. So I don't think that when it just specifically talks about Amnon, that Absalom was just specifically mentioning Amnon. I believe he was talking about all the king's sons, but that's who he wanted to get there. He was trying to get Amnon there instead. And so that's why he asked for the king's sons. Now, verse 24 says, and Absalom came to the king and said, behold, now your servant has sheep shears. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. Now, notice that he invites the king. If David had actually come, then he wouldn't have had opportunity to do this, because I don't believe that Absalom would have killed his brother actually in the presence of the king. So he was pretty sure that David wasn't going to come. He's pretty sure that David was going to refuse it, but he had to make it look good. And so there's some subterfuge going on here, and there's some guile going on here, and deceit going on here. And that's what happens when you harbor malice. You start trying to figure out a way to avenge what it is that you think your injustice is. You start looking for ways to do that, even if it's not right, and you're willing to lie and deceive in order for that to happen. And that's what Absalom is doing, and that's what sin does in our life. And so it says, please let the king and his servants go with your servants. But the king said to Absalom, no, my son, we should not all go, for we will be burdensome to you. Although he urged him, he would not go, but blessed him. And so basically he said, you can have, your brothers go, but we're not going to go, because that would be way too many people for you. And he blessed him. Now, again, you might think that maybe David might have an inkling of an idea that Absalom's up to something. But then maybe not, because Absalom did invite all of his brothers. He didn't just invite one. He invited all of his brothers. I think if he had just invited Amnon, then David might have had more of an inkling. But as you can see, King David isn't the greatest person to perceive things that are going on in his family. And a lot of fathers are like that. They're so busy with work, and they're so busy with trying to make a living and trying to provide for their family, that they don't actually see what's going on in their house, and it creates problems and difficulties. And so anyway, for whatever reason, David went ahead and allowed it. He allowed the sons to go. Now, verse 26, then Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And again, I don't think he specifically was mentioning Amnon. I think the text mentions him, but I think he was asking for all of the brothers to go. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But when Absalom urged him, he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. See, the point is, he's trying to get Amnon there, but if he has to invite all the king's sons in order to do that for subterfuge, he will certainly do that. And that's what he's happening. And so, as you can tell, Absalom is causing sin to get worse and worse and grow worse and worse as he's trying to carry out his plans. Now, verse 28 says, Absalom commanded his servant, saying, see now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then put him to death. Do not fear. Have not I myself commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. Now, it's interesting that Absalom commands his servants to put Amnon to death, and his servants carry it out. I doubt very seriously if his servants would have carried it out just because Absalom said it. I'm pretty sure that Absalom had been talking to them about the violation of his sister and the fact that Amnon was never, ever punished for it. And therefore, since the king wouldn't punish them, that we have to take matters into our own hands. And I'm probably persuaded that that's what's going on, because I have a hard time seeing all the servants say, okay, you want me to just go kill somebody? I'll go kill him just because you say so. That I believe they would have to have reason. And so they're all in this together. in order to carry this out. And basically what Absalom is saying is, look, if I'm wrong, it's me who's commanding you, so I'll be responsible for it, even though you put him to death. That's really what I think is going on there. Now, verse 29, it says, and the servants of Absalom did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. And then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. And so all of the king's sons see what happens. They all run, probably fearing for their life, and they're all running back to David, in order to tell him what's going on. Now, verse 30 says, now it was while they were on the way that the report came to David saying, Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. Now, they didn't have the internet, but somehow the news got there before the people got there. That's pretty amazing, I think. And no doubt probably what happened was as soon as Absalom killed Amnon, somebody jumped on their horse and took off thinking that Absalom was going to kill all of them. And so he got to David as fast as he could, telling David that Absalom killed all of them, when he actually didn't stay long enough to actually see Absalom kill anybody except for Amnon. And so that's probably what happened. But David then, of course, is thinking all of his sons are dead because of what happened. Now, it says in verse 31, then the king arose, tore his clothes, and lay on the ground, and all his servants were standing by with clothes torn. And Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, responded, do not let my lord suppose they have put to death all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead, because by the intent of Absalom, this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar. Now, therefore, do not let my lord the king take the report to heart, namely, all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead. And so, remember what Nathanael said to David when David sinned, and God said the consequences of your sin is you're going to have violence in your house, and there's going to be turmoil in your house. Well, here you go. 2 years earlier, his daughter had been raped. 2 years later, Amnon is dead and murdered or killed at the hand of Absalom, his favorite son. We're to notice that having favorites in your life is not the best thing that we're supposed to do. Is not what good parents are supposed to have. Good parents are not supposed to have favorites, but David did, and we'll see the result of that and what happens. But let's see what's going on here. So when they told him, it says the king arose, tore his clothes, and lay on the ground, and his servants were standing by with torn clothes. So David fell down to the ground, tore his clothes, thinking, mourning. It's a sign of mourning because all his sons were dead. Now, in verse 32, it says, Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, by the way, what I think is interesting is this is the same guy who told Amnon how to get Tamar. Mm-hmm. He's the same guy that did that. And yet here he is coming back to David 2 years later and talking to David about what's going on. And so I find that interesting, but I'm not sure what to make of it yet. But I think that's interesting. Seems that Jonadab was around when not good things were happening, it seems like. And so it says, anyway, the son of Shemaiah, David's son, responded, do not let my lord suppose they have put to death all the young men. But Absalom, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead, because by the intent of Absalom, this has been determined since the day he violated his sister Tamar. And he could have added, and you didn't do anything about it. But of course he didn't. But that's the implication. This is happening because of David's weakness in his family. And that's part of why God says there's going to be those consequences. I often wonder if when God talks about the consequences, he's not telling us that these are things that he's going to do, but these are things that are going to result when you leave God. And when you leave God, these kinds of things happen because you left God. Like I was telling you, this probably happened because David didn't take seriously that Amnon had raped Tamar. And maybe he didn't because he's thinking, well, I took advantage of a woman also. And so who am I to bring judgment down on Amnon for doing this? And so as a result of that, God looked into the future and he saw what was going to happen in David's life. And so the consequences weren't necessarily God saying, I'm going to make these things happen, as much as it is God saying, I know these things are going to happen because you've left me and there's consequences to it. And you're going to see those consequences in your family. And that's what we see going on here, because we don't see any place in here at all where God says, I made this happen or I did this. This was the consequence of David's inactivity because of the feelings that he had as a result of his sin. And also he didn't take care of Amnon when he should have. And so Absalom felt that he had to do it, but Absalom also knew that he was wrong. And therefore this activity is going on. But it did cost the life of Amnon. He finally did receive the punishment that was due for somebody who took advantage of an innocent lady. And he says, the text says, because by the intent of Absalom, this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar. Now, therefore, do not let my lord the king take the report to heart, namely, all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead. Well, it's good that not all his sons were dead, but I don't know if that would make me feel any better, that just one of my sons died. Not sure it would make me feel better, but nonetheless, it certainly would be better than knowing all of my sons died. And so what happens now? Well, as a result of that, we're going to notice what happens with Amnon. So we're going to have Albert read the rest of the chapter 4, starting with verse 34.
Verse 34. Now Absalom had fled, and the young man who was the watchman raised his eye and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's son have come, according to your servant's word. So it happened. As soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's son came and lifted his voice and wept. All the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur and was there 3 years. The heart of David longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, since he was dead.
All right. So remember, sin doesn't just affect one person. Sin affects a whole family. And again, you're seeing that whole family affected here. In verse 34, it says, now Absalom had fled, and the young man who was, and the man who was the watchman raised his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. And so Absalom knew that even though there had not been any justice with Amnon, he knew that what he did wasn't right. He knew that taking matters into his own hand wasn't the right thing to do, because God had told them not to seek their own vengeance. That's what governments were for. And Absalom did wrong in doing that on his own. And that's why he fled. So Absalom wasn't like thinking that he was doing what was right. He knew it was wrong. So he runs, Absalom runs away. And the people who were coming back, the young man, the watchman who was on David's palace, saw them and said, behold, here comes the people from behind the mountain. And Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's sons have come according to your servant's word. So it happened. In other words, Jonadab says, see, I told you, not all of your sons are dead, just Amnon. Now, verse 36 says, as soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's son came and lifted their voices and wept. And also the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. So they're all weeping for their brother Amnon. They're weeping for him. Now, what happens with Absalom? Well, verse 37. Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. Now, I want you to notice something. One son dies, and David mourns for him for a while, because he's dead. Notice the last part of verse 39, since he was dead. So he mourns for him for a while, even though he's dead, but he mourns for Absalom every day. He mourns for Absalom. Absalom's the one who killed his son, but yet he mourns for Absalom. And David, his heart goes out to Absalom, and Absalom was his favorite. We're going to notice that that's going to cause him problems a little later on. But it says Absalom fled, and David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur and was there for 3 years. So now you have 5 years. This is like 5 or 6 years into David's reign from the time he committed sin with Bathsheba. And you notice that it seems like every time, almost every year, there's a major problem or a major trauma that happens in his life. And that's because when sin enters your life, it creates great problems. Verse 39 says, and the heart of the king, David, longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon since he was dead. The idea is since Amnon is out of sight, he stopped mourning for him, but he's still longing to see Absalom, the son that killed another one of his sons. And again, you see David's inability to deal properly with the consequences of his family because he had Absalom as his favorite son. And we're going to notice what happens a little bit later on. But this is a good place for us to stop. And so next week, we'll start with chapter 14. We're going to have Absalom's return. We're glad you were here. Thanks, Albert, for being here and helping out. And he's going to be here with us for the next year in helping us out as we together glean from God's word, those things that would help us be better servants of his. Hope God blesses you in all that you do. Thanks for coming.